Hey everybody, this is Caleb, part of the Narrate team. Today Adam looks at one principle, a principle that is essential for making your dreams into a reality. Dreams like better relationships, finances, and even where you're at spiritually. What if making those dreams a reality are born out of our daily habits? Today Adam explains.
If this is your first Vision Weekend with us before, welcome. Let me just start by saying that in our minds, the best part is really yet to come. That for us, what we'll do at 1:30 this afternoon at Spring Meadow Lake is such a fun experience. Where this year we'll baptize 5 people, and each of their stories are incredible, and you'll hear each of their stories individually over the course of the next couple months. But would really invite you to come enjoy a mostly raw hamburger with us and watch some people be baptized. It's really a fun experience. And the other thing about this weekend that's unique is what you're going to pick up on around here in the next couple months is we're kind of trying to shift the way we interact with baptism. And so while we're going to baptize 5 people this morning, there's another 3 or 4 of them that we're in process with. And we just want to make sure that we're able to walk into that moment with that person being fully confident in what they're doing. And so there's going to be more of this coming, and we'll talk more about that in the weeks that follow and the months that follow. The other thing is, if this isn't your first Vision Weekend, if you've been with us for one before or maybe several before, I think you'll find that this weekend's a little bit different than Vision Weekends in the past, because in the past we've spent a lot of energy looking back and going, here's all these things God did, and really quantifying them and looking at them very specifically, and then looking ahead and going, okay, here's these, I can't remember what was it last year, like 6 initiatives, and last year it was that was to the extent that we needed 2 weekends to do that. And this weekend we're going to do a little bit differently. Those initiatives, they're certainly there, but we're going to tease them out in the months that follow rather than just kind of back up the dump truck right here. And in particular, because this morning there's really just one principle that I want to explore this morning, one idea, really one question that I want to get you noodling on. It's a question that some of you know. Back in August, I had the privilege of going back to Harvest, and they had asked, will you just come share the story? Will you come talk about Narrate? And as I prepared to do that, it just occurred to me that really as I contemplate all of our successes, all of our failures, everything we've tried to do and fail, everything we've tried to do and succeeded, all of the stories that are represented in many of your individual lives. As I just kind of tried to put my head around the last 4 years at Narrate, there was really this one principle that rose to the surface. And so it's that principle in the form of a question, in keeping with our culture, that I want to explore this morning. And to be really honest, lest you think that I feel like I've got life figured out and you don't, it's a principle that I most certainly didn't understand or appreciate prior to moving here way back in 2009, way back before we started this thing, this movement, this church called Narrate. It's a principle that I don't even know that I could begin to appreciate it. And I think part of the reason for that is prior to all that we've experienced here together in the last 4 years, I had really only experienced 3 church cultures growing up in Billings. I was raised in kind of a neat Catholic community, and so that was a good experience for me. But it was really at 17 years old where I started to engage Jesus, and since then, I really had been, prior to Narrate, I've only been a part of 3 churches, an active part of 3 churches. The first one was a place called Faith Chapel. And I know that doesn't mean a lot to those of you not from Billings, but Faith Chapel is not only the biggest church in the state, in my opinion, it's the best. It's an incredible church. I walked in the door there in the mid-90s, and I wasn't there because I was seeking after God or truth or Jesus. I was there because I was seeking after the person I was with, if you know how that works. And yet I was very quickly just amazed. I pulled into the parking lot. I'd never been to church before, where if you didn't get there early, you couldn't get a spot. That was its own experience. And then as you walked to the front door, there were these very warm, friendly, normal-looking people who greeted us, and they didn't creep us out, and they didn't kiss us, but they were just friendly, and they didn't shove things at us. We just kind of made our way in. And then when I got into the lobby of this place, I'd never been in a church like this, being raised in this small-town Catholic church, but it was new, it was modern, it was clean. It wasn't ornate, it wasn't over the top, but it was just pristine. And I would later learn that part of the values around there were that people live messy lives, that our lives are chaotic. And so one of the ways that they try to create experiences for people is they feel like the bathrooms should be pristine, that there shouldn't be any stains on the sink, that there shouldn't be any garbage on the floor. And so the place is just immaculate. Went into the auditorium, and was like, this is church? Where are the wooden pews? There were these comfortable chairs, and what I began to experience over multiple years was incredible music, professional quality music. And then preaching I had no context for this. I didn't watch TBN. I didn't go to church. I had never seen anything. That's not to say that Stan is like TBN, but I had never seen anything like this where I could actually relate to the message, even if I wasn't very interested in the Bible. And Stan Simmons, who will actually be here in November, which will be a real privilege for us, his teaching was incredible. And as a high school kid, I started inviting friends and family. And it wasn't like, hey, like, come meet Jesus. That wasn't it at all. It was like, you got to see this. This is amazing. This is so helpful. I can still remember on my graduation day, despite the fact that I would make not very good decisions later that day, that going to church that morning was a high priority of mine. And so that was one experience I had. The second church experience that I'd had was really the student ministry at Faith E, which is the grandma church of this place. And when I stepped into that role as an intern, that was Vern, who was here a few weeks ago, who planted Harvest, who mothered this place. That was his final year, his 10th year of student ministry at Faith E. And again, I didn't go to youth group. I was confirmed at 17 years old. I did the CCD thing. When my second youth group was my first day on the job as an intern. I'd never seen anything like it. It was a Wednesday night, and it wasn't like a few kids drugged there by their earlobes. There were a couple hundred students that came flooding through the door. And it was this diverse group of students, student body president at senior high, to some of the better athletes, to just normal people like the rest of us. I mean, it was this broad spectrum of students. And again, they weren't reluctant to be there. They were excited to be there. And I quickly learned why, because they had this student band that was incredible. Vern's preaching was insane. And if you could hear some of the things he got away with saying to high school students, you wouldn't believe it. But he was so funny and so over the top and so helpful. And then their small group leaders really sealed the deal. And what I learned is that these guys weren't just there to play Barbies with students. They weren't just there for the free pizza or to make friends. Like the leaders there, many of them, this wouldn't be the only time in the week they would see the students. That they really were living life with their students. In fact, that year there was a gal whose parents died in a fire. And to watch these leaders just huddle around this gal and process life with this gal, it was incredible. The third church experience I had was at Harvest. And having the privilege of being a part of that thing starting up in the very early months, that was its own insane experience. And again, I know that probably many don't know the specifics, but let me just kind of unpack this rather quickly. It was planted in, I think, 99 or 2000, I forget which year. I should have figured that out in advance. The first preview service, there were over 300 people there. So like before they even said like, hey, we're a church. By the first Christmas, there were 700 or 800 people there. By the end of the first year, they were averaging 1,000 people on the weekend. I know it's not all about numbers, but it's certainly an indicator. After coming on staff there in the spring, what I realized is there were never any conversations about, like, how are we going to get people here? It was like, where are we going to put people? Do we need to buy more folding chairs? Because we're using every folding chair that this school has. And kids were doing classrooms in these little nooks because there were so many kids. By the end of the third year, they owned about 40 acres of land and had built a multi-million-dollar facility. By the end of the fifth year, they'd planted this incredible church called Journey in Bozeman. And so what I'm getting at there is when I came here to Helena, I personally had absolutely no appreciation for what we're going to talk about this morning. The question that I want to ask, the principle that I want to bug you to think about. See, some of you, you're those types of people that when you touch it, it turns to gold. You know those people? Like we've been trying to lose weight for a couple years, and you all of a sudden got motivated to lose weight, and in 3 months you lost 25 pounds. Like we've been golfing for a decade, and you say, hey, I'd love to go golfing with us, and the second time you come, you beat us. See, if you're one of them, you don't identify as one of them. That's kind of the way it works, because if you do, you're an egotist and we don't like you. But you don't know if you're one of them, but the person you're with knows if you're one of them. You know those people? Like they get a job and pretty soon they're at the top of the food chain. You get a job and you've been in the same job for a decade. They go to school and they can kind of do whatever they want and they get straight A's, and you go to school and you study your heart out and you get a C in biology. Do you know these people yet? See, for the rest of us, those of you that like whatever you touch, it turns to gold, there's something that we need you to know. And that is that we hate you. That's really the easiest way to put it. And really this idea that I want to explore this morning, it's for the rest of us. It's for those of you that feel relegated to average. Those of you that feel like no matter how hard you work, you'll always be middle management. Those of you that feel like you were just not given enough to be successful, and the most you can hope for is survival. This morning, what I'm hoping is that if you'll wrap your brain around these principles, which are so embedded in what God has been saying for thousands of years, if you'll grab hold of these principles, I think what it'll do is give you handles. And I think what it'll allow you to do is not move through life feeling like a victim, not move through life with self-hatred and resentment and all those things that come with looking at everyone else who is successful and thinking you could never be successful because of this, and this, but instead to begin to understand how you can actually experience some success. Now listen, I'm not going to suggest this morning that all of us have equal talents. Jesus established that pretty clearly. There's 10, there's 5, and there's 1. Most of us, we're not 10-talent people. Some of you are, the rest of us aren't. But what I do think we can do is we can grab hold of some handles where we no longer feel ashamed of who we are. And instead we understand how to move from where we are to where we want to be. And for those of you, you are the whatever you touch, it turns to gold people. Like, listen, you already don't know that. We know that about you. Like that's just part of who you are. You wouldn't be like that if you were one of those people. But what might be true for you is that you're facing a new situation, a new occupational challenge, a new academic challenge, a new physical health challenge. There's this new thing, you're staring at it, you're at this new area of life, this new season of life, and you're not so sure that you can do it. In fact, you're intimidated. And what you're starting to think, because this is what happens, is you're starting to think, I was able to do that business, I was able to get that degree, I was able to get that job, I was able to turn that relationship because I had talent in that area. But I don't know if I have talent in this area. I think what you're going to find this morning is it wasn't because you had talent in that area and you don't in this one. See, I think there was an ethos by which you lived your life. And for you, as soon as I say it, you'll go, oh yeah, I know that. But what I'm hoping happens for you this morning is that you can grab hold of it and reclaim it and exercise it once again, because I know you've done it before. See, the question is this: how do we move from the vision to the reality? Like, how do we move from what we want to be true of our relationships, what we want to be true of what's on the scale when we step onto it, what we want to be true of our occupation, of our education? How do we move from what we want to where we want to be? Like, we all have these moments. We go for long drives, we go for runs, we watch an inspiring movie, we read an inspiring book, we listen to a song, and we have these kind of hormonal moments. I don't know what all the hormones are involved, but I know it's scientific, and we go like, I'm going to do this. And suddenly you feel like you can take on Everest, and you have all these ideas and all these visions. How do we move from there to reality? I was thinking this week about Legos, because you get the both end with Legos, right? You get the box with the fulfilled vision, this incredible airplane, this neat tractor, whatever it is. But when you open it, you just get pieces. But inside with the pieces is the instruction manual to how to get from the not to the have. I think that's what I want to talk about this morning is what's the manual? How do we get from, Adam, I really want to go back to school. Adam, I really want to turn my marriage from D- to A-. Adam, I really want to engage in Jesus and actually experience him personally. How do we move from that to where we want to be? And here's really the question that I want to pose, and we're just going to visit from a bunch of different angles this morning. It's simply this: what if the daily leads to the dream? Like, what if it's the daily that leads to the dream? Because see, sometimes, I know what happens to me, and I guess I'm suspecting it happens to you too, is we get to living for our dreams so much that what we forget is our dreams are born out of our daily habits. And we would like to believe that some people are phenoms and other people aren't phenoms. We would like to believe that God is a God who takes something from like non-existent to existent overnight. And yes, God can do that, but it's not very common in the scriptures. What's more common is a daily grind. What John Maxwell says, that our life and what we accomplish, they're the result of our daily habits. And so this morning, the handle that I want to give you as you begin to try to wrestle with these desires is what does it look like to flesh those dreams out in some daily disciplines, to realize that in your daily habits. And to be sure, this is something that the scriptures talk so much about. I think my favorite place is in the book of Proverbs. And what I love about Proverbs, for those of you that aren't familiar, is Proverbs is written by the man who we're told is the smartest man to ever live, and yet his life is a wreck, which is a challenge to all of us, that knowledge isn't the sum total of the game, that there's more to it than that. And yet Solomon, he absolutely had his finger on this principle. In Proverbs 13:4, this is my favorite instance of this. Solomon says this: a sluggard's appetite is never filled. Now, there's a couple of things I think we need to notice here, because for me, they push against the way I stereotype lazy people or me when I'm being lazy. Like, notice that sluggards, which is simply a lazy person, notice they have dreams. They have ambitions. In other words, those businesses that fail, the people who were leading them, they also had visions and dreams. Those people who apparently don't accomplish anything, whose relationships are a wreck, however you want to fill that in, it's not that they don't have vision. They do. In fact, they have so much vision that it's never satisfied. A sluggard's appetite is never filled. You know what? This is so true, isn't it? Like, there's evidence of this all over our lives. It's the canoe in the backyard that we've used once, right? It's all that weightlifting material that we have in the basement that doesn't get touched. It's those funny ab machines that we have 30 different versions of. It's the 60 credits but no degree. It's all the books that we have that we've never read. It's the 14 Bibles that we own. It's not that we don't have dreams and desires and ambitions. It's that there's a difference between having them and realizing them. See, I love what Solomon says. A sluggard's appetite is never filled. And then look at the way he finishes it. But the desires of the diligent are fully satisfied. See, this is like the most anticlimactic thing I could have ever said to you. Because when we start talking about the one thing that could kind of push us into success, we're like, okay, what's the one thing? Like, I'll wear pink shoes. I mean, what is it? What do I got to do? But it comes back to this really boring, really monotonous principle. It comes back to this idea of what Solomon calls diligence. See, I think there's some importance to just contrasting here. Are some people of vision and others aren't? Do some people want to have great marriages and others don't? Do some Christ followers want to grow in their relationship with Jesus and others don't? Do some people want to lose weight and others don't? Do some people want to go to college and others don't? No, the answer is no. See, we live in this time, and if you study leadership, you know this, where we celebrate visionary leaders so much. We celebrate the creatives. We celebrate those people who dream up dreams and they have ideas and they fulfill those ideas. And don't get me wrong, I think some people are more visionary than others. But Solomon seems to suggest, listen, all of us lay awake at night and we have ideas. We all have instruments under our bed that we purchased with the full intentions of learning how to play, and we never played them. We all have aerobic equipment that we've never used. We all have them. And to Solomon, the answer is what? It's diligence. It's the daily. In 10:4, he says it similarly, and if you really want to grab hold of this idea of diligence in the Proverbs, it could be such a fun study for you. There's some great resources on Google where you can topically search Proverbs, but listen to what he says in 10:4. Lazy hands make for poverty, but diligent hands bring wealth. I think Dave Ramsey in his explanation for diligence nails the heart of Proverbs on this one. He defines it this way. He says, diligence is excellence in the ordinary. See, we all want to be excellent on Visionary Weekend. We all want to be excellent when the lights are on and all the attention's drawn. No. Solomon's going, listen, some people have and some don't. Some people translate those dreams and others don't. And it has nothing to do with the presence of those dreams. It has to do with what they do in their daily routines. Jim Collins, and you'll have heard this before, but Jim Collins rather famously said that the signature of mediocrity is chronic inconsistency. It's the daily leads to the dream. So Solomon calls it diligence. I think Jesus calls it faithfulness. And don't get me wrong, I understand that faithfulness involves believing some things about the cross, absolutely, and our sin and the blood. But sometimes we make faithfulness this really abstract thing that is completely removed from everyday life, and yet that's not the way you see Jesus use the word. There's a couple instances in the New Testament where Jesus is talking to people, and they're wrestling with the things we're wrestling with. Like, why do some have 10 talents and some have 5 and some have 1? And he says, listen, that's not the issue. He tells a story as if to say, like, that part of the equation is outside of your hands. You don't have control what family you came from. You don't have control over your economic status. You don't have control over your biology and what talents you're born with. But listen, you do have control over this. And in each instance, what he commends is who? It's the people who are faithful in the daily. Listen to Matthew 25:23. He says simply, he's speaking to one of these guys, well done, my good and faithful servant. You've been faithful with a few things. I'll put you in charge of many things. You've been faithful with the little stuff, the daily stuff, like Tuesday morning stuff, like off-season stuff. I digress with a Peyton Manning story, and I apologize, but I was thinking this week after watching his masterful game on Thursday night that it's so easy to celebrate a guy who throws 7 touchdown passes and ties an incredible record. But here's the deal. Like, he gets to do that with the lights on and the people in the crowd about 20 days a year. But to accomplish that, there's these other 345 days where he's excellent. And we all want him to be a phenom. But what if he's not? What if he's faithful, as Jesus says? What if he's diligent? Jesus tells another story in Luke, and it's kind of a harsh story. I've always thought of it as harsh. And this summer I was running on Mount Helena, and I've been to Israel a couple times, and those of you that have been there know that like Mount Helena, there's a lot of similarities in the landscape and the way that it would feel, the dryness of the ground, the rock in the ground, even the mountainous feel to it. And so I was running on one of those days where it hadn't rained in a couple weeks and it was really dry. And for whatever reason, I was thinking of Matthew 9:62. I'm just trusting it was a Lord thing. But Jesus says this here: no one who puts a hand to the plow and looks back is fit for service in the kingdom of God. No one who puts a hand to the plow and looks back. See, of course, you know, like we've got to kind of picture one of those kind of early 20th century type plows. It was pulled by an animal or a person or something of those sort, where you stood on it and had some kind of wooden handles. And I always thought that the idea was, you know, in my holiness background, the idea was, well, if you look back, you like create a less than straight row. I don't think that's the issue at all. I think the issue is, oh boy, I've been at this for 2 hours, and how much ground have I covered? This is horrible. I think what Jesus is saying is, look, because when you picture putting a plow in Mount Helena, you can picture, like, before you've even put the blade in the ground, you've probably worked for a couple hours, and now you're trying to get this animal to cooperate and all that goes into it, and you've covered about 10 feet. And Jesus is going, listen, if you're going to be preoccupied with the little details, if you're going to be preoccupied with how little you've accomplished so far, it's going to be really hard to live the kingdom life. Because you're going to put your hands to the plow and you're in it for the long haul, and it's going to be hard work. And Jesus says that's called faithfulness. Jim Collins, and some of you have heard this story before, but I just so feel like it's central to who we are as a church. Jim Collins tells a story in a book called Great by Choice, and I would say, without hesitation, it's the best book I've read since I lived in Helena. And he tells a story in there about 2 explorers. One of them by the last name Scott, one by the last name Amundsen. Each of them, in October of 1911, were making final preparations to lead their respective teams of 5 or 6 people, I believe. I can't actually remember how big the teams were. But the goal was to be the first people in the modern era to reach the South Pole. Now, what's fascinating about Scott and Amundsen is one of them would make it to the South Pole 30 days before their counterpart and would arrive back at the home camp, which was around 700 miles one way, the exact day that they planned on getting back. The other group, of course, would arrive 30 days after the first, and as soon as they turned for home, would quickly find themselves in a battle for their lives, and it would be a battle that they would eventually lose. They would all die out there. And part of his research on this business principle involves them, because he asked the question, why was one group so successful and the other wasn't? And you know something? Some of our cliche things, they don't hold true. Each of them came from similar economic conditions. Each of them had the respective backing of their respective empires, countries. Each of them had any number of different, they could have used whatever technology they want. Money was literally no issue. Training was no issue. Each of them could have trained in any number of different ways. Each of them had incredible backgrounds along those lines. But one of the things he notes, and in his book he unpacks several different answers to the question, but one of the major ones is that one of the groups, they decided that as they were going, they would simply go as far that day as weather allowed. And so if it was a pretty nice day, which is a relative statement when we're talking about the South Pole. But if it was a nice day, there were days where they would cover 35 miles in a day. They would just go for it. But then there were other days where the weather was so bad, they didn't even leave their tents. There were some days where they got going and the weather turned, and so they just went 5 or 6 miles. Other days where the weather was bad initially, and by noon it was okay, and so they went several miles. One group did that. The other group pre-decided, before they ever left, that they were going to go 20 miles every single day. No questions. And so there were days where they were quitting way too early. And there were days where they were out there way too long. And in fact, as they got close to the South Pole, there was an instance where the weather was so perfect. And these guys decided that they should keep going. And their leader said, no, we just hit 20 miles. And they had no idea. Apparently, they were coming at it from different angles. They had no idea where the other team was in respect to the race. And there was almost a mutiny. The guys almost left their leader behind because they said, this is stupid that we're following this dumb rule when, in fact, we could get past because we could easily go 35 miles a day and we could get there in a couple days. And who knows, they're probably taking advantage of the weather. And he said, no, we're not going. And there was a little bit of a standoff. And they trusted him. And they stopped at 20 miles. One of those groups was 30 days before the other one. One of them arrived home on the exact day that they thought they would. The other died. Which do you suppose was which? It was the 20-mile march people. The 20-mile march people said that we're gonna do this. Every day. I have a friend who sold insurance for 30 plus years. His deal was, every day I sell an insurance policy and I don't go home until I do. He retired as one of the, if not the biggest insurance agent in Billings. What is that? It's the 20-mile march. It's this, no, we can do this. See, here's what I didn't have any appreciation for when I left Billings. I had no appreciation for the fact that despite the fact that I showed up to Faith Chapel in the mid-1990s and experienced some of the best leadership I've ever seen and some of the best preaching I've ever seen and some of the best music and the best guest services and all of it, kids ministry, all of it. What I had no appreciation for was that this church had been at it for about 30 years. That Stan, and you'll hear him in November, he is the best of the best of the best, that he had been honing his skill and his craft for decades. I had no appreciation for the fact that 20 years ago, they were a tiny church, that they were just slowly getting better. What I had no appreciation for when I walked into Faith E and experienced the student ministry was I quickly got the impression that all you have to do is say you have free Little Caesars and soda and stir the lemonade with your arm in the got pot, and kids will show up, students will show up. What I didn't appreciate was the fact that, it was incredibly successful, but you know something? Vern was in his 10th year. And his first year didn't look like this. And not only that, Vern was standing on the shoulders of people who had gone before him. That church, Faith E, way before most churches were saying, hey, we're going to prioritize student ministry. 30 years ago, they had said, hey, we should start prioritizing junior high and high school students. That he was standing on the shoulders of youth pastors who stood on the shoulders of youth pastors. That it went back a long ways. That his leaders were incredible. But you know something? They too had been on their own long, arduous journeys. When I left Faith E, I fully thought that any idiot could make a really big youth group. And I learned the hard way that the opposite's true. In fact, Caleb and I had a great conversation with a friend this year regarding some high school stuff. And I was so proud of him when essentially what he looked at this guy and said is, listen, I understand you can be excited to lead a Bible study for 50 high school students. But can you be just as excited to lead one with 4? Because that's what it's going to take. When I left Harvest, I had this glimpse of church planning that was so unrealistic because what Harvest experienced was such an anomaly in so many ways. But there again, the naivety in me is now so apparent. Vern had been leading in that community for 10 years. He himself had been a part of that community since he was born. He was near 40 years old when he started. His team of people, they'd been at it for a long time. The church where they started from was 5 miles in the other direction. People just had to choose which way to point their car in the morning. That the staff had been built into. That there was a church in Harvest in the 60s, or in the Heights in the 60s and 70s called Hawthorne, and they closed their doors because it was a dying congregation. And that there had literally been these elderly women for the last 20 years who had money in a bank account and had been praying for what would be the next church God would bring to the Billings Heights. See, it wasn't a boom, instant, easy success. It too was the product of a grind, of what some call grit, of what those of you who understand things like retirement, you call compound interest. And anybody who understands finances and math on that level will tell you compound interest, at the risk of being sacrilegious, is the most powerful force in the world. But it doesn't translate overnight. It doesn't even translate in a year. And I think for so many of us, we get caught up in wanting a certain type of marriage and wanting a certain type of career and wanting a certain type of spiritual life. But the question becomes, does it translate to our daily? Does it translate to the agenda? One rather famous philosopher said it this way. Go ahead, Jamie. He says this: what is essential in heaven and earth seems to be that there is obedience in a single direction over a long period of time. But you know something? You don't sell books, and you don't fill chairs, and you don't get real popular telling people that the way to success will take them about 20 years. I was listening to a podcast recently where a gal who is this very accomplished author now, the closing question was, okay, so how'd you do it? And she laughed with this almost sinister laugh, and she said, how'd I do it? I've been doing it for 20 years. That's the answer. And I was hungry for a long time, was the implied part of it. You know, my last conversation with Vern, I was in my office. It's the only memory I have of him being in my office. I was sitting at my high table. He was leaning against my bookshelf over to my left. And we were talking about this. We were talking about Narrate. Now, at the time, I was newly enrolled in grad school, and my friend Brian was at Journey, was giving me so much confidence. And I don't even remember the topic of the conversation, but I'm sure it was full of arrogance and egotism and all kinds of superficial types of things. And what I was basically telling him was, you don't know what you're doing. We're going to kick butt in Helena. And Harvest was in this season, and I don't want to get too much into Billings context, but Vern had made a decision that he felt like God was asking Harvest to build a swimming pool for their community. It's something that had been voted no on several times, and so he just had this moment where he went like, Lord, we're going to build the pool. And that sounded fun at the front end, but as a person that was on staff during that season, it was arduous. Did a capital campaign for it. About 50% of the capital campaign actually came in, so they were doing a second capital campaign for it. Major families were leaving the church. I mean, there wasn't a split, but it was a major issue of contention within the culture of Harvest. Even today, you go to Billings and talk with these people, and some people hate the pool, and others fully embrace the pool. It's in the ground now, by the way. They'll do their baptism service at it today, by the way. Anyway, we were in my office, and that was Vern's context, and I must have been talking about Narrate Vision. And he said, Adam, and I looked over at him, and neither Vern and I are real touchy-feely people. But I looked at him, and his eyes were glossy. He wasn't crying, but it was apparent that he could if he wanted to. He said, Adam, don't ever forget that vision is cheap, that you don't even have to get out of the bed to have vision. Like that's the easy part. But the hard part is the fleshing it out. The hard part is pulling yourself through it. The hard part is the daily. Now, it's Vision Weekend, so let's just kind of touch on a couple of areas because see, here's the bottom line is I see evidence of this principle all over our life together. In fact, the first year we were here, we said we want to matter, we want to serve this community. What would that look like? How can we do that? And I got a meeting with who's now a friend, Amy Teagarden from the City Parks, and said, hey, how can we help? And she looked at me like, I don't know. And I now can appreciate the apprehension she had with the church going, how can we help, and not knowing our agenda. And so I was back on the street, and a couple months later, I still remember where I was on a run, and I looked up at all the pine beetle kill on Mount Helen, and I thought, well, man, how could they argue with our desire to help with this? This is everybody's problem. It's the whole community's problem because it's a fire hazard. Maybe we can help with this. And so I got another meeting. I said, hey, can we help with the firewood? And she said, yeah, sure. And she took a risk on us, and she introduced us to a guy named Brad who manages the open lands. And he said, well, I've had this idea that rather than just waste all this firewood, we could split it and distribute it to families who could use the economic assistance need in their homes. And so that winter, we split, 18 cords of firewood. Nothing all that dramatic. It was fun, but it was 18 cords of firewood. Next winter, I think we split 50 or so cords of firewood. We were taking it to Liap Yard and having a blast doing it, and then people would come pick it up at Liap. Last year, we think that we split 100 cords of firewood. And last year, Brad set us up a little bit differently, and he set us up at this barn at this one particular spot. But then last year, we started to notice that the distribution system was broken, that LEAP had changed some of their funding and staffing priorities, and so they weren't distributing it as quickly. And so Sarah had this idea of going, hey, let's experiment. Maybe we could distribute, like not take it to people's door, but maybe we could show up on a Saturday morning and call the client list and say, hey, come pick up your firewood. And it worked. And so this last summer, Brad and Sarah worked out this deal where now that LEAP has lost their yard, they don't even have the yard to deal with anymore. It's Narrate's responsibility. And the goal this year is we'll split about 50 cords in October, and then we'll split 50 cords again in January, and then one Saturday a month in between and after, where we're just going to show up. It takes about 45 minutes, and the 20 or 30 or however many people who want firewood will show up, and we'll put it in the trunk of their Cougar or whatever it is, and on their way, they'll go. And see, it strikes me that it would have been so easy to go, no, we don't want to split 16 cords of firewood. But it's been a grind to build the trust, to get to the place where we can actually contribute on a much bigger level. The other example for me is this funny thing called an Easter egg hunt. I came from a church where we did this gigantic Easter egg hunt, and I had no desire to do an Easter egg hunt. It just, I don't know, we didn't have any desire. And then this retirement home called us up and said, hey, we're trying to start an Easter egg hunt that would get the families of our residents to the Easter egg hunt so that they could kind of interact a little. Would you help us? And we said, yeah, sure, that's what we're about. We love to help people. And so that's been 3 years running. Well, last year, I'll never forget a friend of mine coming up to me after it was all over, and she said, well, that was a disaster because there was just too many people. It just, between you all and your connections and your families and them and their connections and their family, it was just too many people. And so last year it became apparent, like, no, I think we helped them get their thing started. And I'll still remember setting out eggs with my friend Marvin when I thought, you know what? I said, we should do an Easter egg hunt on Mount Helena next year. And it was just like, that is the most ridiculous idea I've ever heard. And I literally texted Amy Teagarden, hey, next year, Easter egg hunt on Mount Helena. And I suppose it was a few weeks later, I had a meeting with her, and she said, Adam, we're in. I talked to the city manager. He loves the idea. In fact, not only can you do an Easter egg hunt on Mount Helena, the city's going to sponsor this with you. It's not about bragging. It's about the daily leading to the dream. We see it also, it's Vision Weekend, so we're going to give you a couple numbers, and those of you that vomit over such things, I'm sorry, just swallow it, and we'll move on quickly. But so we certainly see it in our attendance. We just wanted to show you a graph. Of course, the blue being our first year and the purple being our last year, and so you can see, like, we've never blown up, and yet every year we seem to grow more. In fact, that gets me to that card in front of you. Part of what we're realizing is we've got to figure out how are we going to accommodate a growing group of people. So this isn't overnight, nobody panic, but would everybody grab one of those cards? What would be really helpful for us is if we take about 30 seconds, and I'm going to ask everyone to fill one of those things out. Now, the age and some of that stuff is self-explanatory. Just circle everything that applies to you. If you want to be 20, but you're not, you can circle 20, whatever. But when we get to those bottom two options, are you with me? Are you looking at those bottom two options? Here's what we want to know. We realize that in the next year, we're going to have to create more seats on Sunday mornings. We're exploring lots of ways to do that. The council feels like, though, first and foremost, we need to explore whether or not adding the third service is an option. We know that Sunday night's not an option here. We know Saturday night's not an option here. We've been on this for 6 months. What would be helpful to me is if you would just rank 1, 2, and 3 in each of the separate options. So treat them as separate things. 1 being like, that would be my first option. 2 being that would be my second option. 3 being that would be my third option. And X would be, hell no. Wouldn't go to church then. No way. So if 8:30 is that or noon is that, so does that make sense? 1, 2, 3, or X. Or if you're like, I will only go to church at 9 o'clock, then just put 1 and 9 and 2 X's. We should have had some Jeopardy music or something. So that, I'll trust you to navigate your way through that. We're going to take offering here when the band gets back up here, and you can just throw that back in the bag. While you're doing that, I'm going to also show you a giving slide. We also see this in our giving, which raises the question, wow, does Narrate have any quarterly givers? I think so. It seems like that might be the case. Proud to say to you that once again this year that we were in the black. We were a church that did not bleed any money, and in fact, we're working hard on building some reserve because when we plan a church, we're going to do it with cash. And when an opportunity comes along that's like, hit it now, but it's going to cost $50,000, we're going to have the money on hand. And when we go like, hey, we got to add a third service, and that's going to take some money for some gear, the council's really trying to be responsible on that end. So for those of you that are part of that, and taking what God gives you and entrusting your kingdom investment around here, thank you. But what I really want to focus on this morning is you. Like, how about you? What would it look like for you to translate this into your life? You know, if you're 20 or 30 something, you know what sociologists tell us about us? They tell us that we are the most entitled people to ever walk the planet. You know what entitled means? Among other things, it means that because you want it, you think you should get it. That's what entitled means. I want it, therefore I should have it. I want it, therefore why do I have to work for it? See, the bad news for those of us that are 20-something is we want to accomplish way more in the short term than our 30 or 40 and 50 and 60-somethings friends would tell us is even realistic. And some of you are here and you're thinking about ending a relationship. Some of you are here and you're so depressed about where your career is at, so depressed about where your finances are at, so depressed about where your relationship with Jesus is at. And the reality is you're wanting too much too fast. Listen, it took you 25 years to learn how to not follow Jesus. To think that you're going to learn how to follow him in these splendid, healthy ways in 25 days is just unrealistic. So maybe you don't have to be so depressed. Maybe you don't have to be so down. Like maybe you're going like, man, I thought I would own a house by now. Man, I thought I'd have my house paid off by now. Now, I thought I would know what I was going to do with my life. I thought I'd have my degree by now. I thought I'd be married by now. Maybe you're just a victim of your own entitlement. And maybe the handle is you're on the right course. You're just wanting it too soon, too fast. See, the bad news is that they tell us that us 20 and 30-somethings, we overestimate what we can accomplish in the short term. But here's the good news. They also tell us that we underestimate what we can accomplish in the long term. See, what you're guilty of is thinking that if you haven't accomplished it by the time you're 40, you'll never accomplish it. What you're guilty of is thinking if you don't have the degree by the time you're 24, then somehow you've missed the boat. Maybe for you this morning is the realization of, wait a minute, I'm on the right course. Or I need to create a couple course corrections, but we're going to be okay. And for the rest of you who are in that 40 and 50 and beyond and 60 beyond category, here's what they tell us about you. They tell us that you so buy into the entitlement mentality, that you so buy into what our culture says about the value of youth, that you assume that because you're 40 and 50 and 60 and 70, you have nothing to contribute. And I'm here to tell you as a guy who sits across from young couples and young people day after day after day, that young marriages and young parents and young churches are so desperate for your wisdom. And yeah, you've got baggage, but everybody who has baggage when they're your age. Yeah, you've got stories that you're not proud of, but that's not the point. We need you to engage. Around here, yes, but in the community. Read the Bible, and what you'll see is not very many young people accomplish very much. There are some. And because we're a culture that worships youth, we really gravitate to them. But Moses was in his 80s. Abraham, older than that. We need you to engage. And I think the challenge for you would be, what would it look like for you to establish your own rule of 5? The rule of 5 simply says this, that if there's a tree in your backyard and you want to chop it down, and you commit to hitting that tree every day with an axe 5 times, what's eventually going to happen? The tree's going to fall. It's not if, it's when. And when factors in things like the size of your bicep and your talent level and all those different things. No one's saying that we're all dealing with the same stack of cards. I think for you, the question and the thing that I've so been like, no, I want to take Vision Weekend in a little different direction this weekend would be, what's the rule of 5 for you? What are those 5 things that you need to do every day to accomplish the goals that you have for your marriage, for your relationship with Christ, for your physical health, for your career? I don't know. Maybe even have categorical ones. Mine are kind of messy. I've got 5 or 6. And where it's helped me of late is you know what's not on there? Watching Peyton Manning. But that's okay. It doesn't mean I can't watch him. It just means what I run through the grid in my head is, well, have I knocked out my rule of 5 today? Because unless I have, then I shouldn't be watching this game. You know what's not on there is going to the Blackfoot and enjoying a good beer? Not the end of the world. Okay thing to do. But if I'm not careful, it becomes on my rule of 5 rather than comes after it's been accomplished. In fact, you have a rule of 5. The question isn't if you have one. The question is what's on the list. And is what's on the list really translate to where you want to be? So you have a direction and you're pointed to a destination. and it's found in your daily habits. Let me just close with this chunk from Galatians. In Galatians 6, Paul says, and I found this to be so encouraging over the last few months, he says, let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. You could chart that as there being 4 responsibilities in that verse. 2 of them belong to God. The harvest and the size of the harvest, that's, as we say, God's gig. Your responsibility is to keep doing good, to keep doing the right thing, and to stay encouraged, to stay motivated.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.